It's with great pleasure and honor to have Dr. Adrienne Keene come with us today here in Winnipeg. I've had the pleasure of getting to meet her when we both were part of a symposium at Northwestern University. She also did an amazing job working with a couple of colleagues of mine with the Initiative for Indigenous Futures, Professor Jason Lewis and artist Skye Borg. I know that they had a lot of fun. Adrienne is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation and an assistant professor of American Studies and Ethnic Studies at Brown University. Her research areas include college access, transition, and persistence for American Indian, Alaskan Native, and Native Hawaiian students, including the role of pre-college access programs in student access. Additionally, she examines representations of Native people in popular culture, Native cultural appropriation in fashion and design, and you really need to go see the show by the Ephemerals at Urban Shaman because it's all about, that's their specific work. The ways that Indigenous people are using the internet, social media, and new media to challenge misrepresentations and create new and innovative spaces for art and activism. Since 2010, she's been writing the blog Native Appropriations, which explores many of these issues online. She also has over 12,000 followers. Is it 12K? I don't know how that works in Instagram, but it's a lot of people. And we're really excited to see what some of your new research that you're going to speak to today. And thank you so much for coming. Chimegwich and Marcy.
Oh, that's me. Let me adjust this. Sio Nagata. Hi, everyone. I'm Adrienne Keene. Chichalagi Ayeli. I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. And I'm originally from Dalonige de la Jutla, which is California. And the translation of that is yellow money from the ground, which refers to the gold rush. And I'm currently an assistant professor of American Studies and Ethnic Studies at Brown. So I am so incredibly honored to be here today to kick off your lecture series, to be included with that incredible group of scholars that you have coming, and also to be included with the group of folks who have spoken this lecture series before. When I went on the list, I was amazed to be a part of that. And I also wanted to express my gratitude today for being on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe peoples and the homeland of the Métis Nation with Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples as well. And I also wanted to extend my gratitude to the staff that made this entire event possible, both the folks who prepared the room for us today and the folks who will clean up afterwards, and the staff of the Indigenous Studies program. And of course, give my love to all of the Native students here at the University of Winnipeg and send you strength for pushing through these spaces that aren't necessarily made for us. So with that introduction, I do a lot of public talks, but I always am talking about my blog. I'm talking about representations, I'm talking about cultural appropriation. This year I'm on teaching leave at Brown. I have a research fellowship. I am supposed to be writing my book manuscript. And so I decided that it was about time that I start talking about my actual research that I do and talking about the Native students that I work with. So you have the opportunity to hear very new ideas, things I'm working through, stuff that is going to end up in the book manuscript, but I'm not totally fully formed on it yet. So that is an exciting opportunity for me to kind of work out some of these, and hopefully we'll have some time at the end that I'd love to hear your questions and get some feedback. And I always feel like Indigenous studies up here in what is currently known as Canada is a little bit more advanced than some of what we do in the States, so there might be things that I just don't even know about yet. So I ask for your patience as I sort of am working through some of this stuff. So the game plan for my lecture is I'm going to give a bit of an introduction to the state of Native students in college in the US, and then talk about the organization that I research and work with, which is called College Horizons. and then give a little overview of the larger project that this work fits into, and talk about the main sort of theoretical building that I'm doing right now, which is around these ideas of education as nation building and what that means and what it has meant, and working in some ideas of Indigenous futurisms. And I really hope this all connects in the way it does in my brain, because I swear it works. So with that, I am an educational researcher who tries very hard to not dwell in the negative statistics that overwhelm the research on Native students, especially in higher education. But I did want to kind of give the context of what we're talking about when I'm talking about Native students in college in what is currently known as the United States. So the statistics say that for every 100 Native ninth graders that start the ninth grade, only 48 of them will actually graduate from high school, and of that 48, only 20 of them will enter any type of post-secondary education, and of that 20, only 1 will graduate. So clearly along this pathway, there are many points where there need to be more discussions, be more interventions, really start to understand and theorize what is going on here, because clearly, our students' needs are not being met by the system as it currently stands. I'm balancing 2 computers here, so apologies for that. So this talk today is really a story through my theoretical understandings, and it starts with this tiny, grainy, sad little picture, which is the only picture I have from 2002 when I was a student in a program called College Horizons. So I am in that picture somewhere. I'm in a white sweatshirt in the middle, but I was 16, and I attended this program, and it was life-changing for me. So College Horizons is a pre-college access program that is just for Native students. So in the US, that's American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian students, Indigenous students, and they come from all over the United States. And they're brought together on 1 to 2 college campuses every summer. And the program is a week-long sort of crash course in the college application process. So by the end of the week, the students have a completed common application, which is sort of the universal application that can go out to a lot of schools in the US. A list of 10 schools that are good matches for their interests and their abilities, a resume, and then a college essay, a personal statement that has been through 3 to 4 to 5 rounds of edits. And the amazing thing about this program is the faculty for the program, the folks who are working directly with the students, come from 3 different groups. They're admissions counselors from colleges and universities all over the country, so folks who are actually going to be reading the applications of these students when they apply. Guidance counselors from high-power high schools in the US, where they're working with private school students, helping them to navigate the college process, very high-resourced schools. And then also community counselors who are Native folks who come from high schools that might not have the resources, but have the cultural context and the knowledge that the students are going to need to be successful in this process. So the motto of the program is College Pride, Native Pride. And the idea behind that is that those 2 ideas don't have to exist in opposition to one another, that they can exist together, and that for students to be successful, they have to be able to have that knowledge about the Western colonial college-going process, but also be grounded in who they are as Indigenous students. So this is where the story begins with my research. When I was a student in 2002, the program, as I said, was life-changing for me. I met the admission officer from Stanford University, did not think that I was qualified to go to a place like Stanford. He worked with me on my application, as did other folks there, and I ended up being admitted to Stanford as a senior in high school. And then after I graduated from college, I returned to College Horizons as an admission officer for Stanford. So I was the native recruiter at Stanford, and then came back to the program and was able to work with the next generation of students. And then through that process, decided that it was time to go to graduate school and that there was no better place for me to work and do my research than with College Horizons, this organization that had given me so much. So since 2011, I've been doing research with the organization in different capacities. I did a sort of case study portrait of the organization itself, and then I followed a group of alumni of the program through their first year of college, and now I am working with College Horizons' new program, which is called College Horizons Scholars. And College Horizons Scholars is answering the need of that retention piece. So College Horizons has incredible success statistics for their students. You saw that inverted triangle of what the statistics usually look like or look like nationally. But for College Horizons students, 95% of the students go directly into or 99% go directly into college, 95% go directly into a four-year college or university, and 85% of College Horizons students graduate within 5 years, which is incredible. So clearly something important is going on with this program. But the 85% wasn't good enough for the director of this program, whose name is Carmen Lopez. And College Horizons was started in 1999, so it's a relatively new program. When I went, it was only a few years old. And it was started by a non-native woman named Whitney Laughlin, and then transferred over to Carmen Lopez, who's Navajo. But Carmen decided that she wanted to work on that retention piece and see how we could get more students staying in and being successful in college. So College Horizons Scholars was born. And the Scholars program, the idea is that it helps prepare, it's a summer bridge program, it's for 3 weeks. It helps prepare alumni of College Horizons for that transition to their first year of college. And they do that kind of academic piece where the students are in a writing seminar. They also take a lecture course with me, which is the most fun class I have ever taught. It's called Settler Colonialism, Resistance, and Resilience. And I can't even tell you how magical that classroom is to have about 28 Native students sitting in front of me. Many of them are coming from reservation communities. We also have students from urban and suburban communities, but none of them have ever been explicitly taught about settler colonialism. They have lived settler colonialism every single day of their lives, but they have never had the experience of learning about it in this academic context. And it's just watching minds get blown every single day when I'm standing up there, and it's really fun. So this program is the newest phase of College Horizons, and once they go through this program, they receive wraparound advising through their whole first year of college. So this is the next step of my research. I'm going to be working with the program to look at our data from the evaluation that we've done, which could be an entire other presentation. It's really a magical program. So the larger project, how this all fits, this is the working table of contents of my book manuscript. So I'm going to be talking about College Horizons as a program, but also the faculty of the program and the ways that they work together to create institutional change at their own institutions, the students themselves and the different pathways that they take through their college experiences, and then College Horizons Scholars as a program and the kind of innovative things that are happening there. So what I'm going to be talking about today is sort of fits in the introduction part. This is my sort of theory building, trying to figure out what my actual theoretical framework is for this book. And I have been sitting on this data for many years now. I've been sitting on this book manuscript for 4 years, and I couldn't figure out what it was that was holding me back from really pushing the project forward. And I was really struggling with it and couldn't figure it out. And this talk today is basically what I realized was holding me back. So, the framework that I used for my dissertation and for the earlier versions of this book manuscript is Native nation building. And this is something that I was first exposed to through the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development, which is at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. And I got my doctorate from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And at Harvard, there were no Native faculty while I was there. At the School of Education, our director of the Harvard University Native American program adjuncted at the Kennedy School and the Education School, but this was the only place that anything around Natives was going on at Harvard at the time. And so nation building in its original conception was born in kind of the 1990s-ish by two non-Native economic scholars named Stephen Cornell and Joe Kalt. And their idea was, it was during this time of self-determination really becoming a movement in the US of giving control back to tribes, of letting them assert their sovereignty, that was the wrong wording. Nobody was letting them assert their sovereignty, of recognizing tribes' inherent sovereignty. And Cornell and Kalt had this idea beginning in the mid-70s that this idea, which was revolutionary at the time, that a belief that Indian nations should determine their own futures. And they believed that shaping the futures of communities was not this idea of, quote, simply the assertion of sovereignty. It will require the effective exercise of that sovereignty. So the idea of building these viable nations, in their words, was really through this lens of economic development. So for them, they believed that there were kind of two approaches to nation building that they had seen in their work. One was the sort of jobs and income approach, which focused on the facts that there weren't enough jobs, there wasn't enough income in a community, and attempted to solve that problem through bringing businesses into a community or through grants or outside investors. And they talk about the downfall of this is that it obviously relies too much on outside resources and doesn't create systems that are sustainable for tribal communities, and in many ways are just temporary fixes. So they propose this second form, which is the nation building model. And instead of looking at those sort of immediate problems of lack of jobs and income, it looks at the bigger picture. So what does it take to create, quote, a nation in which both businesses and human beings can flourish? And this model is more proactive, looking at long-term goals and community well-being. And, but they acknowledge that you can't have these lofty goals without a strong system of self-governance and institutions in place. So through this, they developed 5 areas that they say need to be in place in order for sovereignty and this idea of nation building to have practical effects. And so these are their 5 areas that they determined. Having stable institutions and policies, fair and effective dispute resolution, separation of politics from business management, a competent bureaucracy, and finally, cultural match. And so they talk about these ideas of having basically the ability for tribes to enact their sovereignty, to practice their sovereignty. The cultural match piece is the part that I find the most interesting, and it looks at everything from tribal constitutions to the ways that their dispute resolutions are set up, and thinking about traditional forms of governance and if that actually matches the tribal constitution or if that actually matches the bureaucracy that is set up. But the question that arises out of this to me when I was going through this is, but where does education fit into this? It's very much focused on economic development, of bringing in investors, of bringing in, so it expands this idea of investor to include anyone who cares about the well-being of a community. But in the original conception of Native nation building from the Harvard Project, they don't explicitly mention education at all. So then that brings us to these ideas that emerge more recently. In 2012, Brian Brayboy and his colleagues put out a monograph about Native higher education. And through that, they extended this model of nation building to kind of make explicit some of the things that were already implicit in it. And so they see nation building as this confluence of factors in the legal, political, cultural, economic, health, nutrition, and education aspects of a community. So their idea is education as capacity building. So in order to assert your sovereignty as a tribe, in order to have folks who can run those businesses, who can serve in tribal leadership, who can do all of these things to make that functioning, happy, healthy community, nation, you need folks who can fill those roles. So Brayboy and his colleagues posit Native nation building through education as capacity building. So you're building up the capacity of a nation, of a community to assert its sovereignty. So they say nation building cannot be fully realized without some agenda of higher education. And this seems kind of logical, that of course, but it definitely was not something that was included in the original theorizations of Native nation building. So this is something that College Horizons has embraced as their model. That's why I am interested in nation building. Beyond the fact that I was at Harvard and was exposed to it, this is something that they actually explicitly talk about in the model of their program. So Carmen says, I always like to describe College Horizons as this nation building model. I don't want people to see Native college students as racial and ethnic minorities only. These are nations. These are the people of nations that we are talking about right now. I want to drill home the message to students to help raise their self-awareness and their consciousness about their own relationship to their tribal nation as political citizens. I don't think it was I was really introduced to that myself until years later in college. So I want to plant that seed with the students to let them know that we're not just investing in them because of their race and their ethnicity. We're investing in them because of the capacity of Indian country. I think that's what my larger vision for College Horizons is, this nation building through education. And I want the students and the faculty of the program to understand that and to buy into that. So because of College Horizons' relationship with this idea of nation building, that's why I chose it as my framework for the work, because it comes directly from the program itself. But as I was moving through it, I kept asking myself, okay, so what are the reasons, why are we so invested in this idea? Where is it coming from? And I realized that through my interviews and through talking with students and talking with Carmen, the reason why these models resonate is because it gives an answer to why college. Because for a lot of Native students, college is still, we have these legacies of, and I always debate putting even this picture in, this is an audience that knows about residential schools, that knows about boarding schools, but a lot of audiences I talk to don't know about that history. But this is not that far away. That is not that far removed from our students' experiences, from their families' experiences, from their communities' experiences. And so when we think of the history of formalized Western education in Native communities, it's a history of assimilation, it's a history of cultural genocide, it's a history of pain. So why would we want our students to go into these white Western colonial institutions if that's the legacy that we have? And so the idea of education as nation building gives us an answer to that why. It says that higher education is a means to build up the capacity of your community. It's a means to give back to your community. It's a means to build up the capacity for asserting sovereignty, improve the quality of life for Native nations and the nation that you come from. And so that is a lot of the reason why these theories, I think, hold so much weight in conversations around higher education research. But that's where I stopped. And that was where the book kind of sat for 4 years. I had this deep discomfort with those models and couldn't actually figure out where to go from there. And I think it's very obvious when I put them up there, or at least now it's very obvious to me, that of course, these models are so rooted in white Western capitalism. The idea is that the only way of thinking about a nation is through a model of the nation state, of thinking about sovereignty as only being able to control your own institutions, the biggest piece was I was brought back to my students and thinking about the huge weight of responsibility that they feel when they are presented with these ideas, and that it becomes almost limiting for their possibilities, for their futures. They think about, well, if I'm going to go back and build up the capacity of my tribe, then I need to go to college and get a degree that is going to help me do that. So I'm going to be a doctor, I'm going to be a lawyer, I'm going to be a teacher. And those are the only sort of futures, the only sort of pathways that they see for themselves. And that didn't sit well with me, because in these students, I see so much possibility. I see so much amazing talent and creativity. And in those models of nation building, I don't see a place for all of them. And especially with these ideas of giving back or coming back to your actual nation, to your reservation, to your reserve, that is very limited in scope and possibility for students. So it ignores the fact that today's world of connected social media and abilities to travel and move, that we are coming and going from our communities all the time, whether virtually or physically, that we can be doing work from afar that directly benefits our communities, that we need artists and musicians and writers to build up our communities and our understanding. So I needed to understand what nation building was beyond those white, Western sort of capitalistic models. And I want to be clear that I am so appreciative of the work that Cornell and Culp did and that Brayboy did in building out this theory, because the work that the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development has done through the years is remarkable and incredible. When I was a student at Harvard, there's a nation building course that you can take where you are matched with a community. Communities present projects to the course and ask for Harvard graduate students to come work with them for the semester. So I got to do an incredible research project with Haskell Nations University in Kansas through that project. So there's a lot of amazing work that is going on. And I think that moving these ideas into the realm of education was a really important step. So there are things that I'm still figuring out and need to have as a foundation for this project moving forward. So I'm going to bring it back to my students again. So in this class that I taught, settler colonialism, resistance, and resilience, the way the calendar worked out this year, we actually had an extra week. So last year, this is my second time teaching it. Last year I taught it, and we had 8 classes. This year I taught it, we had 9. And so I was trying to figure out what to put into that slot for the extra class. And I am really newly interested and excited about these ideas of Indigenous futurisms in a way that I haven't been before. And I think a lot of that has to do with some of the just incredible, amazing work that is coming out by folks. There are like just a few examples up here. But so that week for class, I decided to introduce these ideas to our students. And the idea of Indigenous futurisms is based off the ideas of Afrofuturisms and was a term coined by Grace Dillon, who is Anishinaabe, and Rebecca Rowanhorse, whose book is actually down there at the bottom, Trail of Lightning, which is incredible and everyone should read it. I have a quote from her, and she said, "Indigenous futurisms is a term meant to encourage Native, First Nations, and other Indigenous authors and creators to speak back to the colonial tropes of science fiction, those that celebrate the rugged individual, the conquest of foreign worlds, the taming of the final frontier. Indigenous futurism asks us to reject these colonial ideas and instead reimagine space, both outer and inner, from another perspective." So when I was presenting this to my students, I had them read excerpts from an amazing anthology, which is called Beyond Body, Space, and Time, which is kind of queer Indigenous science fictions, futurisms. I had them read an essay by Rebecca Rowanhorse and had them watch a few clips of different things online. And what was amazing to me is this is a group of students who are so connected to everything in social and new media, but they were so enthralled by these ideas. This picture at the top of the Navajo woman comes from a short film called The Sixth World, which is available for free online and is about a Navajo astronaut in the distant future who is helping to take the first ship that's going to colonize Mars. And to see that world that is a science fiction sort of futurist world, but to have Indigenous understandings in it was really powerful for the students, and kind of another one of those mind-blowing moments where they had this moment to imagine an otherwise, to think about what life would look like in a different space, a different time, a different perspective, without the boundaries of settler colonialism as we know it. And we actually started the class by watching the Black Panther trailer, because to me, that was when a lot of this sort of clicked together for me, was watching Black Panther on the big screen and thinking about, while that is definitely an Afrofuturism film, it's also about a place that was never touched by colonialism. Wakanda is a place that was never touched by colonialism. And the power of seeing that on the screen, I mean, it still like gives me goosebumps. Like thinking about that representation and how important that was to see what technology can look like when it's done through the vision of Indigenous people, and how powerful that imagining can be. So putting Indigenous Futurisms in the course wasn't just a break for the students to kind of see some cool, read some cool stories, see some cool videos. It was tying in with the whole course and talking about these ideas of imagining a world beyond the now, imagining a world beyond settler colonialism, and imagining a future. And this to me becomes very important because of thinking about the future that we are entering as a world, and a future of climate catastrophe, a future of uncertainty around even these institutions that we are in, of higher education. And so how do we encourage students to still find their place in these institutions, to still find their way through higher education when that future that we're looking at through this sort of Western linear time is uncertain? So that brings me to these new formulations of nation building that I am starting to think through. And I'm not at all going to claim that these are my ideas or that they're even new or revelatory, but I wanted to kind of show that journey through this, of how our understandings as scholars can really change and shift as we move into new spaces, as we're exposed to new ideas. Because I think a lot of the work I do is about trying to be transparent in my thinking, be transparent in my learning. I talk about on the blog of these ideas of consenting to learn in public. That's what I see my blog as, that I can always revisit ideas that I put out a few years ago. I can update them, I can mess up, I can apologize, and that I'm letting people sort of see that process with the hope that they will undergo that process themselves and be willing to learn and willing to make those mistakes. So I'm now moving into this new area where it seems like such a light bulb, like duh moment, but of course, nationhood does not have to be tied to settler notions of the nation state. And so what does it mean to think about nation building outside of those settler notions of what it means to be a nation? And so I've been reading Leanne Simpson's incredible book, As We've Always Done. And she says that she thinks about nationhood based on a series of radiating responsibilities. Indigenous nationhood is a radical and complete overturning of the nation state's political formations. It is a vision that centers our responsibilities. And so when we start to think about Native students going through the college process and those responsibilities that they are placed with, that are placed upon them in the original conceptions of nation building, are still very economically driven. You're going to be a doctor or a teacher and serve our nation so more young people can be successful. There's not really a deep place for culture and for cultural understandings in that model. But if we, of course, think about nationhood as being much broader than just those boundaries, then clearly there is a lot more that we can think about. So the first piece is moving beyond the notion of nation as being tied to nation state and thinking about it more as a web of responsibilities, of connection to each other, connection to land, connection to traditional teachings, and how that all comes together to create an Indigenous nation. And then I also have this understanding that is something that is relatively new and very exciting, mostly because I tried, well, I didn't try. I taught this text to my students this summer. So to my 18-year-olds, we read A Third University is Possible. Is anyone familiar with this text? Exciting. Okay, so this is by La Paperson, which is the pen name of Wayne Yang, who is a settler scholar in the US who does a lot of incredible work around ideas of decolonization. And it's a little tiny book. It's like about this wide, about this big. It's a little pocket-sized, and a relatively quick read. And so I decided to present it to my students as part of our syllabus this summer. It is a dense theoretical book. It has brilliant ideas in it, really useful ideas, but it's also a struggle to get through if you are just finishing high school and have not yet been exposed to college-level Indigenous theory. So I wish I had some of the memes to show you. Our students had a group chat that they used throughout the program, and were very into creating Indigenous memes on this group chat, and about half of them were about how they had no idea what was going on in this book, and cursing me for assigning it to them. But the first line of this book is, within the colonizing university exists a decolonizing education. So La Paperson Yang is putting forth this idea, this theory of what he calls Skye Borg. And that is taking of the idea of cyborg and sort of extending it into being a way to talk about structural agency. So meaning that a Native student, that a student who is within a colonizing university is able to have the agency to, in his words, wreck, scavenge, retool, and reassemble the colonizing university into decolonizing contraptions. And he says, Skye Borg is system interference, system witchcraft, a ghost in the machine. So this, to me, was such a sort of liberating idea, a revelatory idea, that is something that I think many Native students have been doing implicitly or explicitly throughout the entire understandings of Native people in these colonizing universities, is taking the pieces that are useful, taking the pieces that are helpful, taking the pieces that are radical and revelatory, and remixing them and retooling them into things that are going to serve community needs, to serve Indigenous futures. And so this, to me, is now that final sort of answer to why college. To have a Skye Borg nation building idea means that you can remix and retool, that you can be the... Do folks up here know about Hamilton, the musical? Okay, so I mean, every time I think about this, I just keep thinking about the line that's like, we had a spy on the inside, Hercules Mulligan. So every time I'm always like, spy on the inside. But that's the idea of Skye Borg, is that you can be within the colonizing machine, but not of it. That you can take the pieces of it that are useful, that you can remix them for subversive means, for decolonizing futures, for end goals that are not just a well-paying job that is going to get you to a place economically that you're happy with. It's not, it's giving students another reason for being in these university settings. And so I'm gonna return to my notes a little bit here. So this idea of a Skye Borg nation building really appeals to me, and it gives a new reason for why. It reminds us that the university is also world making. That's a line that that Yang uses, is talking about that the university is world making. So it can be making a first world, it can be making a colonizing world, or it can be making a third world. It can be making a third university, a decolonizing world, and that is a really powerful idea. So in combining these new theoretical ideas with the experiences of my students that I've worked with all these years, the lessons that they can offer me through this are basically just the simple idea that a Native nation doesn't have to conform to traditional notions of a nation state, that as Native students, their presence and success is incredible resistance to the settler colonial machine, and that they're contributing far beyond just their presence in their tribal homelands physically by giving back. So thinking through these ideas of Skye Borg, they're taking the kind of bits of colonizing technologies to construct a decolonial one. They're not not traditional, blending and building and finding their own pathways. So my beginnings of theoretical understandings is a reimagining of education nation building outside of colonial Western capitalistic notions of what a nation means, thinking about how just this imagining is radical and deeply necessary and a decolonial work in itself. So traditional notions of nation building limit, and they ask so much of our students, but they also don't take into account technology, social media, and connections across time and space that weren't available to our ancestors. So every time they removed us from our lands, they assumed that they would sever our identities and our connections to our cultures, but the opposite happened. We found each other, we built community, we strengthened and created cultures. So in Indian relocation in the States, when folks were relocated to urban centers, we formed urban Indian centers. When my people were removed on the Trail of Tears, we formulated a new identity and community in what is now Oklahoma. So Native students in college are finding and creating campus communities. They're creating and finding online spaces and identities and new ideas about what it means to be Indigenous in the 21st century. So Indigenous nation building in this understanding is Indigenous world building, Indigenous future building, imagining an otherwise, a space beyond where we are right now. As the world burns around us, education is providing a space to construct a radical new identity of what it means to be Indigenous outside Western constructions and identities. So the overall framework for my book is this idea of education, higher education as creation. And I think about creation in an Indigenous sense, not the sort of Western, rooted in Christian theology idea of like, in the Bible, how everything was created in sequence. It started with nothing, and then everything was created in sequence, and then it was done. Indigenous creation is much more starting with something. Our stories often don't start with nothing. They start with something, and there's an idea of movement, of transformation, of going from one state to another, and that creation is ongoing and constant and not something with a finite end. And so that's what I think about college, is that for these students, it's building upon what was before, it's creating, it's transforming, it's moving from one stage to the next. So constructing this next stage of nation building is as a creation that is necessary for this moment in our political time, as the purposes of education and the shapes of higher education are going to be changing dramatically in the next decade. So in the States, without affirmative action or public universities, how can education as nation building begin to transcend the actual walls of the university? What can we learn that can be applied to other educational contexts? And then what is the goal if college isn't there anymore? How can our nations move forward and beyond if this pathway becomes cut off? So becoming a doctor or a lawyer through a Western lens to serve Native peoples is important because it's taking away the power from white doctors to pathologize, demonize, and it's reframing and recognizing the power of Indigenous knowledges, and the root cause of illness is colonization. So that's one pathway through this. So nation building in 2018 has to be world building. It can't be nation state building. It must be more radical, more brave, and more dramatic than just a skills-based learning model. We're creating tribal citizens who need to be able to imagine and otherwise break the machine, figure out the future of Indigenous peoples in an increasingly unstable and dramatically different world. Scholar Kachabaldi, she's incredible, also has a blog, and she wrote this blog post that went kind of viral in the States about The Walking Dead, the TV show, and it is about the idea of zombies related to the apocalypse and Indigenous futures, but basically the bottom line is that Indigenous people have already survived the apocalypse. Our apocalypse has already happened. And so we're the survivors that were able to subvert and mold the colonial machine to our purposes. And now more than ever, it's time to see higher education as the space to do some of that dramatic imagining. And so I want to end with this idea of education as gadugi. And this is a word that comes from my language, and it means working together towards a common goal that benefits the overall community. So it's one of my favorite words. And for a long time, I've used it in my work to think about like, oh, like at college, yeah, we all need to work together towards this common goal. but the direct translation of Genuki is putting together the bread. And it comes from back when in our communities, everyone had their own garden, had their own sort of farm plot that grew corn and beans, which is what our bread is made out of. And so if there were community members who were elderly or infirm, otherwise sick and couldn't take care of their gardens, there was a group of community folks who would go around and take care of their gardens. And that was Genuki. They were helping to put together the bread by tending the gardens of the other community members. So I definitely use this in my understandings of what college is. It's working together towards that common goal that's going to benefit the overall community. But putting it in conversation with these ideas about Indigenous futurisms, about Skye Borg, I also think about just the basic reality of creating an Indigenous future where we can put together the bread. And what does that look like 2 decades from now, 3 decades from now, 100 years from now, if our waterways are poisoned, if our lands are inaccessible, we need to find new ways to remix and reframe and put together the bread in a way that is still distinctly Indigenous. And so that's what I hope for my students, that's what I hope for the future of our communities and for institutions of higher education that are serving these students, that we can find those pathways through, that we can think about the ways to be the spies on the inside and working towards those overall goals of Indigenous nation building outside of the kind of white colonial constructions that we've been given. So I will end there. Wado, thank you.